So, do you think about your purpose as something that's like outside in, where you look at everybody else and you see what's everybody else's purpose and therefore I choose my purpose? Or do you spend a few years working on building yourself? And then from within, truly, your true self will tell you, your authentic self will tell you, hey, this is a problem I want to solve. And then you follow that purpose, regardless of what you think the outcome is.
Hello, and welcome to A Work in Purpose. This is our podcast for igniting and reaching our purpose together. My name is Wing. Like many of you, I am just an ordinary seeker. During the great pause of 2020, when all of the external distractions suddenly disappeared, I, like so many of us, had a lot of time to reflect and discover inward. I eventually wondered and got stuck on one of life's most perplexing questions. What is my life's purpose? And I know I am not the only one. That is why I am inviting you to join me on this journey. Let's discover, ignite, and reach our purpose together. On most weeks, I'll be sharing a podcast episode of me interviewing people from all walks of life who are working towards some kind of purpose, whether it is with their career, volunteering, creativity, spiritual practices, or just how they approach everyday life. Along the way, I'll also be sharing some insights and practical tips I learned on how to discover and reach our purpose. I hope they will inspire you so we can all become a work in purpose. And if you would like to be a part of a supportive community of other seekers to help you reach your purpose, I invite you to join our Facebook group, A Work in Purpose. Our guest this episode is Dee Guttikonda. Dee is a mother and a serial entrepreneur. She is working on her purpose of building a business called Maahi to help reverse climate change by turning people's backyards and unused places in cities into local urban farms at scale. Dee did not reach this clarity about her purpose just out of nowhere though. Her journey was a rather long, unexpected adventure that just built upon itself. After many years of feeling lost, Dee went on a yearlong backpacking trip around the world by herself. In this episode, we'll learn how this trip helped Dee discover her true self, which ironically made her feel even more lost and severely out of place after returning home, and how it was then that Dee started exploring spirituality on a deeper level, which clarified everything for her and awakened her to a clear view of her own path and eventually her purpose. Hey Dee, welcome to A Work in Purpose. How's it going?
Thank you, Wing. It's going great. I'm
Great.
quite excited to do this.
Yeah, I'm so glad to have you on. So I want to ask you, let's begin because you were telling me that you had an aha moment recently this year where you kind of discover your life purpose. Can you share more about what purpose you're working towards right now?
So, the aha moment is really a culmination of many moments of almost what I call a conscious awakening. I think when people say they've had aha moments in their life, it means that they've been seeking on some level, they've been asking questions, and that kind of culminated into kind of like a light bulb moment because a whole bunch of ideas or thinking or realizations have then synthesized into one moment, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the aha moment that I had earlier this year was that I had to work on this one particular project, which I'm now calling Maahi. The name of the startup is called Maahi. And the focus for Maahi is going to be to figure out a business model that can create urban farms and urban gardens that grow food at scale within cities. So, with urban farming, there is a lot of urban farming that's happening all across North America and around the world.
Mm-hmm.
And I think if the statistics are to be believed, about 20 to 30% of the food that is accessible within urban areas globally, it comes from urban farms, which is quite a significant portion, but it still means that we rely on big agriculture
Mm-hmm.
um, solely or significantly for our food requirements. Now, whether this is fruits and vegetables or this is meat and cereals and grains and pulses, et cetera, et cetera. So the aha moment that I had this year is how do we bring in more land within cities under urban agriculture? And how do we do that as a movement? But how do we also do that as a business model? because essentially not-for-profits in and of them, in and of their nature, in and of their model, are not very scalable, even if they're doing very exciting, revolutionary work. Uh, so the purpose that I'm embarking on now is to find a way to create something called a restoration economy, which is an economic model to restore the planet.
Mm-hmm.
And we're going to start with bringing more land under urban agriculture and doing it in a more of a platform model sort of way. I know this is vague, but we can dive into the specifics later on in the podcast.
Mm-hmm.
But high level, that's what it is.
Oh wow, that sounds very fascinating. So what made you decide that urban farming is what your life purpose is, and how did that happen? Like what about your background made you realize that is your calling?
It's interesting. There's nothing about my background that would have made me realize that urban farming is what I'd like to embark on now, because there's nothing that I've done really in the past that really relates to this. Um, so, one thing I'd say is that in terms of life purpose, I would say this is my life purpose now. This might be my life purpose for the next, half a decade or decade, because let's assume that it turns into a full-fledged business model. And to be able to grow it, I have to commit like about a half a decade or decade of my life. So it's my purpose for now. I can't say that I know that this is the calling for for the rest of my life. So having sort of prefaced that, I would say that, in the last couple of years, just as a quick background, I used to be a tech entrepreneur. I built and sold a software as a service startup called Fast Forms. I built it when I was living in Toronto, and it was very fast growing. And we basically I basically built and sold it within about 3.5 years,
Mm-hmm.
which was a really fun, exciting ride. Uh, b- but around 2018, I had an opportunity to exit once we got acquired. I transitioned the team over within 6 months, and I had a really amazing opportunity to exit because the company that acquired us was then acquired by a private equity company, actually. And then they were able to just kind of pay me out in full and discharge all my obligations. And then I had the choice to go back and work with them as a senior director, or to basically, kind of go my own way. And I decided to go my own way, partly because my daughter was about a year and a half at the time. And, just when I saw what it took to kind of to build Fast Forms, it was literally 16 hours a day, 7 days a week. I didn't take vacations for about 3 years. I'm not proud to say that, but that's what it needed to be able to build such a fast growing startup really quickly. So I decided, you know what, I want to stay home. I want to be a nurturer. I want to be a mom. And around that time, I started to because I had a lot more time on my hands, I just started to awaken consciously to what was happening in the world in terms of the huge systemic issues around plastics pollutions, excessive consumerism, excessive extraction of resources from the planet in a very unsafe, that happened in a very unsustainable manner. And then finally, climate change itself, and I think in the last year and a half, I started to read a lot about climate change and just some of the problems around climate change. And initially, I have to be completely honest, when I saw the scale of the problems and the scale of the issues, I became very despondent, because it seemed like to me, at least based on what I was reading and what scientists were saying, that our window of time to turn the boat around was really just about a decade or a decade and a half. So we're looking about anywhere between 10 to 15 years to turn the ship around. And if we don't, then we might go past a point of no return. So initially, when I read that, I thought, wow, like governments have been trying to do this with like the Kyoto Protocol, the Paris Accord, and all of this for a long time without achieving any meaningful results. What are we going to do in the next decade, given that we're almost at the precipice? And I think that's the time that a part of the awakening was, look, if I'm an entrepreneur, which I am, then I should be looking at finding systemic solutions for systemic problems. Despondency is not going to help anyone. And I think that's where there was a new resolve to want to find systemic solutions. And I didn't know it would be in the space of agriculture. It just so happens that uh, I just kept reading about climate change. And then I realized that a lot of the problems, holistic systemic problems, stem from the way agriculture is done in the world. And first of all, agriculture is a contributor of it, is like, I think the topmost contributor of greenhouse gas emissions, uh, which contribute directly to climate change. And it's being done in a very unsustainable manner, which is therefore degrading the land and desertifying the planet. And then it's also consuming a huge amount of resources and causes very big systemic inequalities. So there was a lot of things that are very interrelated, and it also causes environmental degradation because when you're doing these large monoculture type of agriculture to supply sort of like the big food industry, then essentially the only way to do it is to degrade the land and using a lot of pesticides, using lots of chemicals, and as a result of which there's degradation of the land, but there's also agricultural runoff that then pollutes all of the water bodies and things like that. Um, so I kind of just started awakening to that and just learning about it. But even then, I had no resolve that this is something I wanted to do something in the world of agriculture, just because it was so far removed. I mean, I've been a city girl my whole life. My uncle is a farmer; he's an organic farmer. But for me, as far as I'm concerned, I've always grown up in big cities, very concrete jungles, metropolitan cities, and Toronto is very, very much that. Um, and 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 as much as I'd like to work in agriculture, I'm not a farmer. And I didn't think that if I'm not from a farming background, I can have any impact of any sort. So then fast forward to 2020. So, anyways, these seeds were being planted just through my own education and just through my own personal interest in trying to understand what are the root causes of these systemic issues that lead to climate change and global warming. And understanding that agriculture, besides many other industries, is the main contributor. And then fast forward to 2020 when COVID-19 broke out. I think we basically saw everyone got exposed to this is that there was a huge impact on the food supply chain. As in, when we went to our grocery store, so many of the things that we were used to finding, we could no longer find, right? Simple things. And I'm actually vegetarian. I can't say I'm vegan. I do eat dairy sometimes, but I'm vegetarian, and our family consumes a lot of fruits, a lot of vegetables. And even though I was aware that most of the fruits and vegetables are not locally grown in Canada. Like a lot of the Indian vegetables or some of the, avocados that I enjoy, they don't grow in Canada. I know they come from Mexico and elsewhere. But when I saw so many of these aisles just almost empty and having to substitute with other things that were more locally grown, that's when I really started questioning what the food supply chain looks like. And, the thing with me is when I start questioning something, I really get deep into it. And I spent a few weeks, I think almost a month, just researching how the food supply chain is structured. And then kind of realizing that, hey, the food supply chain is completely unsustainable in the sense that from the time things are grown and they come from the farmers to retail, there's about 15 to 20 nodes in that system. And anytime you have a big economic shock or big macro societal shock like COVID-19, that system is so fragile because there's so many nodes in that system that it can potentially collapse. And COVID was just one shock, right? But let's say we had multiple shocks to the system at the same time. Like, let's say we had the pandemic, and an economic downturn or recession or a depression and something else, then essentially we would be left to fend for ourselves and we'd have no food security, especially for people that are living in urban areas and have no access to land to be able to grow their own food. So that was very eye-opening. And then the other thing is how unsustainable that is because, most of the food that is grown for travel as opposed to grown for nutrition. So the food is grown in such a way that it has to be harvested and then it has to sort of mature or ripen as it's traveling. So it's grown for travel, not necessarily keeping in mind human well-being, not for nutrition. So then what is the impact that has on our systems, right? And understanding that there's a correlation between the rising physical illnesses as well as mental illnesses and the kind of food that we're putting into our systems. There's a direct correlation, actually, if you start to really look into it. And because, the food, our bodies really are just an extension of the planet and the soil that our food is grown in. And if that soil is degraded, And if that soil is lacking in nutrients and micronutrients, it's going to show up in our systems, you know. And once we lack the necessary nutrients and micronutrients that keep the fundamental system working, then that's then going to show up in terms of many physical ailments as well as mental ailments, because the body is one whole. The mind and the body are interrelated. You know, they're not separate entities. And now I think there's enough research to establish the gut mind connection, that if the gut microbiome is not well balanced, then the mind can also really suffer in terms of like they're relating depression and psychosis and many other mental ailments with just gut imbalances in gut bacteria. So when we talk about the human body, this is a very, very delicate system. And that's very correlated to the delicate ecosystem of our planet, like the micronutrients in our soil, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if food is being grown for travel, then essentially food is not being grown keeping human well-being in mind. It's being grown just keeping economics in mind, like who makes money and who makes profit, right?
Mm.
So that, like, having a deeper understanding of all of that sort of gave me this aha moment back in June, that unless we grow food hyper locally in a way that is actually scalable and has an economic model, as in the farmers that are growing this food are making money to do so, and consumers are benefiting from the hyper local food, unless we do that, we can't actually break free from the cycle of just this nutrition free, tasteless, environmental degrading big agricultural produce, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of when I set out on the journey for Maahi. And right now we're working on ways of experimenting to find a business model that can basically turn people's lawns and other unused spaces in cities into agricultural land, which is to grow produce at scale. So we're going to start testing some of these models in Vancouver in the next year. And once we find a business model that actually works on small scale, then we start to look into how can it work on a large scale. And in many ways, I think, you know, in this economic model, it's not the produce revenue, because, you know, farmers can't make much money just from produce revenue, right? So there's got to be other aspects in the business model that actually make this a profitable endeavor, and that's really what we're testing.
Mm-hmm.
So it's still early stages, and I've been lucky enough to be introduced to 3 young farmers who are just incredible. I think they're between the ages of 22 and 24, and the level of social consciousness that they have is just so fantastic. And I think when I presented to them this new paradigm that let's do this as a business economic model that can then scale as opposed to a not-for-profit, they were excited. Obviously, they're coming into something that's not ready, set, go. They understand that they're coming into something that we're going to be experimenting with and testing over the next year. But the fact that they're open, and the fact that they're just willing to come on board and trust me and trust the vision has been a real blessing. So I think I have a really awesome team ready to go. But I hope that answers your question. I think the context was necessary to explain the aha moment, because aha moment is not just a moment. It's a culmination of many, 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 many things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. That sounds so fascinating. Yeah, it's like a great purpose to have. And you're gonna positively affect so many people in this world if this takes off, which I'm sure it will, because I know you're a very hardworking and intelligent person, and you are like the ultimate problem solver. And I actually want to step back a little to dig a little deeper into how you became who you are today. Like, what was your family background? Where did you grow up? Where did you discover this deep work ethic that you have?
That's really funny, because I don't even know if my family background has anything to do with this, because I think there was nothing in my early childhood that would predict like social consciousness or um, wanting to have an impact or wanting to develop systemic solutions. I grew up in India. I actually grew up in a very, very middle class family in Hyderabad in southern India, in a relatively conservative family. I was the only child, and my parents were, I would say, just not very well to do, just kind of like average. And I think, and I grew up in an apartment building. In fact, I grew up in an apartment building that was overlooking the largest slum
Mm.
in the city.
Hmm.
So, like, by no means did I grow up with a lot of means. So it was, I had nothing, no shortage of like, food and shelter or anything like that, but we weren't particularly well to do. And I just grew up like a normal Indian kid, like, would go to school. And then every summer I'd go to my grandmother's for vacation. This is very common Indian tradition that back in the day, there was no concept of taking international vacations or even vacations around India. It just wasn't a part of the culture. So every summer, all of our cousins, we would get together at my grandparents' home in a different town called Anantapur, and every summer was just spent carefree, just playing with the cousins, and that's kind of how the summer would fly by. But I think the one notable aspect of my childhood was that I just really hated school.
Oh.
Yeah, and I remember just having like these multiple like breakdowns before I had to leave my grandmother's hometown and go back to the city because I just kind of hated school and I hated education. And I had a love-hate relationship with it. There'd be a year when I'd work really hard and I would do very well, and the next year I'd lose motivation and not do it really well. And that kind of remained a theme in my educational sort of like history. Much later, I realized that the educational system is really here to create cogs in the machine. And I think the one thing that people never noticed about me is that I just had a very creative mind and I had a very entrepreneurial mind, right from my childhood. But in a culture like India, that's not necessarily nurtured in a girl child. So the narrative that I was given growing up is that, hey, you're not very good at math or science, but you're quite pretty, so you might want to consider marrying a really rich guy.
Mm.
And so my whole life I was kind of like, growing up, I was just primed this way.
Oh,
I
wow,
was just, that's
fascinating.
kind of what I was told. Yeah. And in fact, now when I look back, I had a lot of capabilities in the sense that I was a writer, I was a poet, and I think I won my first like writing competition when I was, I think, 8 years old. I started writing poetry since I was 7. I was writing for Youth Times, for the Times of India. So I just naturally had very strong written and verbal abilities,
Hmm.
which again wasn't really encouraged because my parents just didn't know. Like, for them, it didn't, I wasn't following a script, right? I wasn't going to become a doctor and engineer. So then they didn't know how to nurture any other abilities, really. And because I was kind of told all the time that, hey, you're pretty, so you should just get married, I actually lost all interest in education. And in fact, what I started to do is I started to do part-time modeling, and I was doing like a lot of like beauty pageants in school and things like that. And then I had a pivotal moment in 2001 because my parents decided to immigrate to Canada.
Hmm.
And when we came here as immigrants, it was a whole new ballgame because we had no social safety net, no family safety net, nothing.
How old were
My
you?
mom, I was 16,
Mm, okay, wow.
turning 17. So, I already had like a significant foundation in India, right?
Hmm.
And then I had to come here, go to high school for a year, and then off to university. And my mom, for the first time, she was a homemaker and she had to go to work. So really, I was kind of left to fend for myself. And, all those like silly things that I was doing in India, like silly aspirations I had about being a model or whatever, no longer fit in the Western context because
Hmm.
like models here are very different, and and then I think I kind of just awakened to the fact that, oh man, I have to make something of my life because otherwise how am I'm just going to flounder here. And so I think that's when I just started to get really involved in university and do things and became a part of student clubs. And I think I kind of had to push myself just out of necessity,
Hmm.
because, like, our survival was at stake. My parents weren't making all that much money, even less than what they were making in India, right? Without any of the social safety nets like family or anyone to support us. So I think that's when I started to have an awakening.
How did
And
you discover that if you don't make a change that you're gonna flounder? Was there like a moment, or how long did that take for that process to play through?
Took a couple of years. Like, it was really hard. I found high school really hard, and I found university in the beginning very hard
Hmm.
because I couldn't really relate to the kids here. none of the pop cultural references I got. Like I grew up with Bollywood movies and sing and dance, and I was like one of the coolest kids in India, like, because I was a model and I was really kind of in the cool circles. But when I came here, I had no reference points. Even simple things like Sesame Street or whatever kids grew up with here, like their music references or cultural references, I couldn't relate to anything.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember, I think I had these moments where people would call me a fob, which is fresh off the boat,
Mm-hmm.
and kind of make fun of my accent and things like that. And I realized at one point that the more I got made fun of, the more it like fueled my fire to want to stand out, you
Mm-hmm.
know, because I couldn't stand being ridiculed or mocked or standing out like a sore thumb.
Mm-hmm.
So I actually would, yeah, I kind of went into overdrive where I studied all pop culture and I studied like just everything, everything. What did these kids grow up with? What kind of music? What kind of TV shows? What kind of whatever, I went into overdrive and just did all of that. And I think within 2 years, everything evolved, including my accent. I dropped my accent within 1 year, so no one could call me a fob anymore.
Oh, that's impressive. 1 year.
Yeah, it was. And in fact, I had a linguistics professor tell me that, usually after the age of 14, it's very hard for people to change their native accent. But I think that's just how I'm built, which is like if I'm looked down on, then it gives me fuel to really like rise up like a phoenix.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that was a propeller for me. And I think within a couple of years, I was able to blend in 2 or 3 years. But you know what? It still didn't make me happy because I was doing things to blend in and not to be my authentic self. So there was many years there that I was just doing things just to seem cool or just to kind of blend in and to get approval and things like that. But I think around 28, 27 or 28, I decided that that wasn't going to work for me any longer. And I was going to shed that persona as well. And that I didn't want the drive to prove myself to be my primary drive, you know.
Mm-hmm.
So I decided, I made a conscious decision I was going to shed that. And that's when other things emerged, like other aspects of my personality emerged, which is so much of my drive now to do things is truly because I would like to find solutions to systemic problems. I don't want to be part of the problem. I want to be a part of the solution. But that is my authentic drive. It's not something I cultivated just to fit in or just to stand out or anything
Mm-hmm.
like that. But
Yeah.
it took a while to undo so much of the stuff that I gathered as an immigrant.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I would say there was really nothing in my childhood that would potentially make me stand out. And my family didn't wasn't very aspirational or anything like that. I mean, they didn't have any aspirations for me. They just thought if I'm married and I have children, that like I'm good, good to go. And and that was actually like a huge handicap for me because you get conditioned, you grow up and you're getting conditioned like that. And then around 18 or 19, I started to discover I had aspirations. I had drives, I had motivations. And then I was very driven. Like if I set my mind to something, I would really just go after it. That came that that came square. Like it was just such a start, because the conditioning is okay, just get married. And now I'm discovering drives that I want to do something. I want to be a doer. I want to be an achiever. So those just collided like that. So in fact, my parents didn't give me a whole lot of support when I was being driven to do things. Like when I was an undergrad student at U of T, I co-founded University of Toronto's first national business conference as an undergraduate student, which was quite an endeavor because me and this other girl for 18 months, we worked on this project. We kicked off this conference. We raised $100,000, which is a lot of money for like
Wow.
20-year-olds to raise
Yeah.
from different pockets of money. We're selling the vision to the dean, to the provost, and getting all these pockets of money, convincing sponsors to come on board. We were also developing a curriculum that's not your typical student conference, but was like an entire business simulation where you come into the conference and you're basically actually in a case study, but a live simulated case study where you're problem solving, you're building a company in different regions and you're doing all the stuff. So even the curriculum and developing the simulation for that, we had to work with professors to create all of that. So it was a very ambitious project for 20-year-olds, but we pulled it off. And I think that it's around that time that I just started to realize certain entrepreneurial abilities and things like that. And my parents weren't very supportive of that because they were like, hey, it's taking away from getting grades in school, and you're spending so much time creating this project, and you're not studying enough. It's very typical Asian Indian mentality. You're just not studying enough. How are you going to get a good job when you graduate, right? I don't blame them. That's their conditioning. But I didn't really have a whole lot of support. So I think many times I felt that I was just swimming upstream.
Hmm.
Uh, because I kind of had to fight it. And then when I was in university, I was also doing a lot of theater, which my parents did not support because they just thought it was a waste of time, that it didn't necessarily contribute to my grades, which would get me a job and then potentially get me a husband who's a doctor or super rich, like none of what I was doing was contributing to their aspiration for me. So many of the times I felt like I was swimming upstream. It was a struggle for sure. But I
Hmm.
think it was a necessary struggle because it made me realize that, okay, am I willing to put a stake in the ground for what I believe in? I
Hmm.
didn't know that at the time. I didn't have any of this clarity. This is me just looking back at my 20-year-old self. But there was some part of me that just, it didn't matter. Like, if I thought I wanted to do something, I'm going to do it and I'm going to execute regardless of what my family was telling me. So that was a necessary struggle to
Hmm.
establish, a certain kind
Yeah.
of foundation, right?
Yeah.
Um,
So you mentioned earlier that around like 27, 28, you had this switch where you were operating off fear of getting people's approval to then living your own authentic life based on what you want. Can you talk more about that process? How was it like a just a sudden switch, or what happened leading up to those years that made you realize, you know what, I'm not gonna care about what other people think anymore? Like, how did that happen? Because a lot of people never really make that switch. They still operate off of that fear, you know?
Yeah, actually, that goes back to something that I felt when I was 19. I remember feeling when I was 19. So, when I was kind of developing this persona of being very Western and just trying to fit in with the other kids, and just, I think, whatever a teenager goes through, I remember having this very like stark feeling that, oh, what is this? Like, why do I feel like I have a hole within myself? And from that hole, something is kind of like bleeding out or draining out, Uh, and and then around 21 or 22, I just started to meditate. I think it just randomly, like I would just YouTube meditation videos and kind of go like to some meditation classes or whatever. I just kind of started to do it. I don't know why I did it. I just started to do it because I was feeling very tormented. When you're not your authentic self and you're pretending to be somebody else, it's a very tormenting place to be because it's such a big discrepancy. You're pretending to be somebody you're not. And then around 22, when I left University of Toronto, I always had this desire to travel. So what I did is, like, over a course of a year, I essentially kind of backpacked across the world. A lot of it was solo, some of it was with friends, and and then that became the best sort of life education that I had. Nothing that a university could give me because I learned so much about people, the world, cultures, and that's when I dropped a lot of my ideas about what is right and what is wrong. Because so much of what we do is just is so cultural, it's so conditioned. What seems what seems good to us and what seems evil to someone else is all relative to where they grew up and what their conditioning is. And so there's two things I developed then. One is that so much of the conditioning I've received in my life is just conditioning. I don't need to subscribe to it. If I choose to drop it, I can drop it. The other thing I realized is how to really just work with people. I learned a lot about people, just understanding people. And, partly because I was a solo female traveler. And as a solo female traveler, you have to develop and trust your own instincts because I was traveling in some parts of the world that are not exactly safe, like
Mm.
South America, etc.
Hmm.
And when you're traveling in these parts of the world where it's not exactly safe, then you have to develop and hone your instincts about people. And you have to be hyper vigilant. And that 1 year of kind of doing that really made me instinctive and really just helped me study human beings, which then contributed to successes later. Because when you know how to work with people and you understand people, uh, it leads to a lot of success
Hmm.
because you have to inevitably work with people, right? So once I came back from that trip, I just
Let's talk
realized,
more
okay,
more about that trip actually. So it
yeah,
was for 1 year. You were traveling
yes,
backpacking by yourself. That's
yes.
amazing. Like, how did you get like develop that courage to decide I'm gonna do this for a year, and how did you prepare for it?
It didn't start as a year. It kind of started as I'm going to do this sort of like trip. I'm going to go to these countries and I'm going to, go to some international conferences that I got accepted into international student conferences. So it didn't start as a year, but then once it started, the bug had bitten me and then I just kept going. In terms of courage, I would say there was no courage. I wasn't thinking. I just made a leap. Like if you
Mhm.
think too much, then you need to muster courage to do it. But I was just following an instinct and a desire. And I wasn't even thinking about it in terms of courage or, will I be brave enough to do it? Once I started doing it, I just sort of realized, okay, there's a way to do it. And there's a way to travel safely as a girl, as a 22-year-old girl, and how do I read cultures and kind of educating myself as I was going along. And I had saved quite a bit for a few years, but even then I ran out of money and I
Mm.
had to borrow from my parents, I had to borrow from friends because I wasn't expecting to travel so much, right? So I did a lot of borrowing, which then I did a lot of repayment of over the years.
Mm.
Um, so it just happened, and then once it happened I just kept following my instincts,
Mhm.
and that's where my instinct as a higher faculty started to develop, where especially when you're traveling, uh, like you make a lot of decisions instinctively because you can't read everything, right?
Mhm.
In a culture where you don't know the language or the cultural benchmarks, you have to trust your instinct. So that's when I really developed my instinct as a faculty. So it just kind of happened, I would say.
Mm.
It was meant to happen.
Yeah. What was the first country you went to?
The first country that I went to, I'm trying to remember, it was in the Middle East. I went to Dubai and Abu Dhabi.
Mm.
And that was because I was accepted to a student conference
Mhm.
that the Sheikh of Abu Dhabi was running. And I had to write a paper, and everybody whose papers, all the students whose papers got accepted, got invited to the conference for free. We just had to pay for our flight ticket, which my parents paid for.
Mhm.
Having said that, obviously they were supportive on some level, even though I've said that they weren't primarily supportive of many things. When I really made an argument and made a case for it, they did pay for many things, this being an example. So that was the first country that I went to. Uh,
Was
and
that
it
the
was,
country that inspired you to travel more, or was it another country that gave
yeah,
you the
it was
bug?
the country. It was the country that inspired me to travel more because, at the conference, I met these like young change makers all around the world, because the type of like students that come to these conferences are internationally, like, they just have a global consciousness. Because, between the age of, they were all between the age of 21 to 25. Some were undergrad students, some were master students. And some of them were young change makers. They were doing great things in the world, and we met some of the top minds in the world, like Professor Muhammad Yunus, who won the Nobel Prize for economics for his microfinance model, Grameen Bank, in which then revolutionized microfinance in the world. We met Shashi Tharoor, who at one time had campaigned to be the Secretary General of the United Nations, but had lost, but is an incredible mind and an incredible personality. So we met a lot of these uh, huge figures during that conference, and also meeting a lot of the young change makers that were doing incredible things was a part of the awakening. And that inspired me to travel, because I always had this bug to want to travel, and I decided when I graduate I'm going to travel. But when I saw what these young people were doing, it just like strengthened that resolve. And that's why I think they say it's really important who you surround yourself with, because you kind of become the average of the people that you surround yourself with. I don't agree about the average part, because sometimes you can be much better than the average and you can still surround yourself with the average. It all depends on you as a human being. But they definitely had a big influence on me when I saw how they were wired and social consciousness at 20. They weren't just preoccupied with boys and dating and sex and alcohol and partying. They actually wanted to do something with their lives. And that ignited a fire within me. It was just, I think the spark was always there. I could never put words to it. But when I met these young people and saw what they were doing, it just was like boom, like it just went off, and like everything, a lot of things developed in that 1 year of travel, like a social consciousness, a political consciousness. um so yeah, I would say that conference was very pivotal for me. Going
Hmm.
there was very pivotal because it wasn't just tourism, right? It's
Right.
just very much meeting like-minded people.
Yeah. Would you say that's like the one country that impacted you the most, or was there another destination that did that?
Every destination impacted me in a different way,
Hmm.
completely. Because I think in every culture, you learn something different. But there was actually two aspects to this. I'll tell you about the favorite place, my favorite place where that I traveled. But most importantly, one thing I realized when I was traveling through all these countries, whether this was in South America or Europe or the Middle East, India, Southeast Asia, what I realized is that because of globalization, there was such a unanimity in the sense that very strong cultural institutions in those countries were getting broken down and just being replaced by McDonald's and Starbucks. So wherever you went, like wherever I went, if I was taking the train in Europe from one town to the other, I would see like Toyota plant, or like I would see McDonald's and like near the Spanish Steps in Rome. It's just, like you would see that all these big pillars and big cultural institutions then were kind of being faced off by these Western cultural institutions, which are not really cultural institutions, they're just big corporations like Toyota or, McDonald's or Taco Bell or whatever it was, right? So that was disappointing actually when I saw that at 22. And I thought, wow, look at this. This is just like the whole world is becoming the same thing, really, even though there are very significant differences, the whole world is just aspiring for the same thing.
Hmm.
And that same thing is not even that great. Like it's just junk processed food and
Hmm.
consumerist culture. So
Yeah.
that was a big awakening. But but in terms of some on a positive note, like what I saw, the place that I really, really love um, was, I would say South America. You
Hmm.
know, I just really loved because I was in Venezuela and I was in Venezuela during the Chavez student protests
Hmm.
in 2008, if I'm correct. Yeah, sorry, I'm getting my timelines mixed because this was almost 12 years ago now, 12, 13 years ago. And I happened to be there, and there was like a real revolution because, as you know, Chavez was a dictator and is like progressively became a dictator with absolute power. And when we were there, the students had to start to come out in the streets protesting against this dictator, wanting a different option, wanting different leadership. And at the time, I happened to be in the city in Caracas. And talking to these students and met some documentary filmmakers that were interviewing these students. And I mean, I didn't know Spanish, I still don't, but just hanging out with these people and kind of like interacting with the documentary filmmakers. And at the time, I also was with somebody else who knew Spanish. So just, I think having these conversations and hearing from them about what it is that they were standing for was very, very fascinating. It's very fascinating. Again, it was the same theme, that young people wanting change and wanting to stand for something, and wanting to replace a system that's not working. So it's kind of the theme with which my travels started. Young people wanting something different and having a different vision for the world. Now,
Hmm.
whether they're doing this in terms of like as social change makers, or whether they're doing this as by protesting on the streets, it's just people that are not complacent,
Hmm.
young people that are not complacent,
Hmm.
that wanting something different.
Hmm.
So
Yeah.
Venezuela had a huge impact on me when I saw that. I mean, I like this is a long story, but I almost got arrested as a part of the student protest
Oh.
because they thought I was one of the protesters as well. So came pretty close to disappearing into a Venezuelan prison.
Oh, wow. How did you not get
And
arrested?
oh gosh, man, like that was a crazy story. Like these documentary filmmakers that we were with, because the armed forces had like rolled in with tanks and tear gas, and they were essentially spraying tear gas on students and arresting them,
Hmm.
first immobilizing them and attacking them, and then arresting them. And because I was with a documentary filmmaker and his, I guess, girlfriend or wife, I can't remember, I guess his girlfriend at the time, and this other friend of mine, we and he was very, very well versed with the city. We managed to escape, because I think he got some intelligence that the army is going to be rolling in and things like that. So we managed to get out of there just in time. So we didn't get cordoned off by the army. So that was a close call. And then we escaped into the mountains. I forget what it's called, Mendoza or something like that. It's so
Wow.
long. I mean, I never documented these stories.
Uh-huh.
And then they had to lay low for a while in Mendoza, because I think the government or some government agencies knew that the documentary filmmaker had been very involved in capturing stories. And of course, because so much of the media is controlled for propaganda. Essentially, if you turned on public television, it would be Chavez on TV just doing propaganda, like straight up propaganda, uh, which was so eye-opening to see that the kind of conditioning people are put through, just mental and social conditioning, that they have no access to any other resources. I think even if you have access to the internet, I mean, so much of it is controlled, right, through
Mhm.
firewalls and things like that. And this is when, in 2007, 2008, like the internet wasn't as ubiquitous as it is today. I mean, it was starting to get fairly ubiquitous thanks to social media, thanks to the birth of social media. But even about a decade ago, it was a different story compared to what it is today. So just to see the influences of that this media propaganda and government propaganda had on people was so interesting. So the documentary filmmaker's life was at risk because he was documenting stories that are anti-propaganda and that are relating true stories. And then I think his documentary then made it to the BBC, if I remember
Mhm.
correctly. Um, so just kind of being in that influence and hiding out for a while and then surfacing and then leaving the country, and finding a safe way to leave the country unscathed without getting arrested. That wasn't an adventure in and of itself.
Yeah.
And my husband and my husband often says now, he's like, Dee, when you travel, can you please try not to get involved in some sort of intrigue? Can you just like go there and not get involved in intrigue? Because I've had other stories where I volunteered in Uganda, uh, and then I got involved in some intrigue there, and my husband, who then was my boyfriend, had to like fly me out of Uganda,
Uh-huh.
like, and so yeah, now every time I haven't traveled like that in a while because I'm a mother of a 4-year-old, and I was building a startup for a few years before that. But yeah, about 7 years ago, my husband, everywhere I went alone, he'd be like, just please don't get involved in intrigue. Don't
Mhm.
call me and say I have to fly you out of there.
Yeah.
Uh,
Wow. What a crazy adventure you had. Oh my gosh, I can't even imagine. So you've had that 1 year profound life experience, and then after your long trip, you had to go back home. What was that transition like for you?
it was awful. It was really bad because yes, in the 1 year, it was just such an awakening. But then I'm going back to, people that haven't had that awakening, right? My family. So they can't understand where I'm coming from. And to them, I just seemed confused, which I was, because once you have kind of like an awakening and then
Mhm.
you're expected to come back and comply with a script, uh, that becomes really, really hard. And it was very hard to explain to my parents just I mean, I don't blame them, right? It's just they didn't have the experiences that I had. They didn't have the drives that I had. The same thing with my friends, actually. It's not just my family or anything. The same thing with my friends. They were just playing to the script. They were getting jobs in accounting firms, and they were getting like a $40,000, $50,000 salary, starter salary. They were all working towards their chartered CPA, chartered public accountancy degree, or their CFA, or working for 2 years, getting ready for law school. I mean, everybody I knew was just playing to a script.
Mhm.
So that was very hard to kind of come back to and kind of figure out, well, why am I so different? And there's no ready made answers. Like, that's the journey a human being has to go on. Or why am I different? And then when I came back, I wasn't quite sure what to do. So then I studied like comparative politics and governance for a while because I had a political consciousness that I was awakening from that year away because of that experience in Venezuela, but many, many other experiences.
Mhm.
Um, Everywhere I went, I would understand the cultural and political history of that country. and obviously having traveled a lot in Europe and parts of South America, like it's hard to escape that history, right? And it's very much there.
Mhm.
It's not covered up. It might be covered up in the Middle East by the money and the show and the bling, but in these other countries, it's just not covered up. Same thing in India, or same thing in Southeast Asia. Like many of these countries have histories of military dictatorships and genocide and all sorts of things, and it's very hard to escape all of that, and economic upheavals and everything that these countries have been going through in the last few decades. So when I came back, decided to study comparative politics and governance, and I thought that that might give me a way to figure out what I wanted to really do in my life. And then I actually volunteered for the Obama campaign in 2008. So I'm Canadian, but I flew to Philadelphia to volunteer for his campaign for a month, from the Chinatown office, because he seemed to be that voice and that political figure that really represented the aspirations of my generation, the millennial generation that was politically conscious.
Mhm.
So that summer, when I think I was doing some kind of like menial job while I was trying to figure out what to do with my life, before I went back to school. And then I was like a receptionist at like like construction civil engineering company, and I had a lot of time to read Obama's biography as well as his other book, and that contributed part to the in a big way to the political awakening, just kind of the work that he did with community organizing. And then I went out and I supported the campaign. In fact, I was in Philadelphia when he won his first term, which was so historic
Mm.
because I was there on election day. And,
Wow.
it was just the most historic, pivotal moment in my life and in the life of the nation, right? And then after that, I came back and I still didn't know what I wanted to do, but I kind of like went through with the degree. And after that, I was really confused, like in the sense I had a lot of like it was a tormenting period because again the drive is everyone's asking me what job are you going for? Are you going into consulting? What are you gonna do? Are you gonna just like what kind of conventional career are you gonna go to? All this other stuff. But I just had a tough time. So, anyways, while I was doing all the conventional career stuff, I also started working for a publication that a friend of mine had started called A Developed World. And what A Developed World was doing was that we were writing about social entrepreneurs, these entrepreneurs who wanted to make societal change, but they were doing it as a social enterprise. So my friend invited me onto his founding team, and I was one of the writers for the publication. And I had a chance to fly out to Boston, where we had a partner, which was Harvard Kennedy School of Government, and meet a lot of social entrepreneurs at the conference itself. There was a conference, social enterprise conference, and I had a chance to meet a lot of social entrepreneurs. And because I was writing about them, I could just see other models of doing business, but
Mm.
having impact at the same time. And that was a 2-year journey, and that really was very eye opening for me. And that led me to then volunteer in Uganda for one summer in 2010, where I was working for an organization called the Ugandan Rural Development and Training, which was a very interesting organization. They had just rejected all Western models and they were kind of developing their own rural development training process that was authentic to their culture. That was a very corrupt organization, as I
Mm.
found
Mm.
later, unfortunately. So any level of idealism I had about that got shattered in the 2 months that I was there. But at least they were doing something different. They were not following Western models. They were following models that were true to their own culture and that could work. Um, so like I did a lot of experimental things like that before I kind of yeah, and then I did a little bit of documentary filmmaking because I was just experimenting with different things. I was dying to find what was true to me.
Mhm.
So I did a little bit of short documentary filmmaking where I was, interview like my first documentary film was really about the organic food movement in Maine and just how significant that is. And the second documentary was about food faddism. I was really fascinated by the food fads in our society. Every year there's like a new superfood like goji berry or kale or moringa or whatever it is. And there's all of these food fads. So I was really kind of fascinated by that. And I was making a documentary on like what drives food faddism, and ultimately the conclusion I came to is just big money, trying
Mm.
to market. It's just big food industry trying to generate big money and just push food fads. So, I mean, as you can see, I did a lot of things. I had to do a lot of things to kind of like really figure out who I was, because if you don't play to the script, and if you don't play to a script, then you have to chart your own way, you
Mm.
know. And it's around that time that I started meditation and things like that because I was so tortured and so tormented from within because I wasn't finding this thing that was my life's calling and my life's purpose,
Hmm.
that I just started meditating because I couldn't bear the torture of my own mind. So yeah, I would say there was a lot of experimentation. That's what led me to meditation
Hmm.
and trying to connect with myself.
How did meditating help you discover your purpose?
That also is not like a straightforward answer. Just one second. I'm just going to plug in my laptop. I mean, even with meditation, I had to do a lot of like searching in the sense that I tried this kind of meditation, that kind of meditation, the other kind of meditation. But a pivotal moment in my life was at 24 when I had two pivotal moments where I encountered Eckhart Tolle. Do you know Eckhart Tolle?
Oh, yes. The power of now.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. Power of Now and a New Earth. And I don't know if you remember in 2008, Oprah Winfrey did this huge global webcast with him for 10 weeks,
Hmm.
where every week they would read one chapter of A New Earth. And then globally, people would tune in and Eckhart would talk about the ideas in the chapter. And then people would talk about how that was changing their lives, et cetera, right? So it was this like global community that got built around this one book. And what was interesting is that as I read that book, literally every sentence in that book made sense to me. Every sentence. In fact, I think I underlined every sentence in every page, by the time I read that book, because like I was like, oh my God, this is so true. And that is so true. So many of those things that I couldn't put words to, like all of the things, all of the confusion that was happening within me, because I was kind of awakening, right?
Hmm.
But I didn't have a vocabulary for that awakening. Eckhart Tolle had the vocabulary for the awakening. So as I was reading it at 24, everything made sense. Like I just realized, oh, this is what I'm seeking. Um, but the thing with Eckhart is like he talks about being in the present moment.
Hmm.
He talks about the pain body, about neutralizing the pain body and connecting with oneself as a result of neutralizing the pain body and not identifying with it. But it was so hard. Like, how do you do that? It's not a technique. He's just talking about what you can do, but he's not talking about how you can do it. And I remember once doing an Eckhart Tolle meditation in my room and thinking to myself, my gosh, like I wish I could be like Eckhart, but it's so hard. Like he just talks about present moment, but I can be anywhere but in the present moment. It's just so difficult to be in the present moment. And I started to search for the how,
Hmm.
like how do I do this? Like this is not working for me. I need a how, I need tools, I need technique. And that's when in the year 2012, after about 4 years of like asking how, and reading many spiritual masters like Michael Singer, Gary Zukov, Pema Chodron, the American monk, Jack Kornfield. I mean, like umpteen number of spiritual teachers, reading every book on personal development and spiritual development out there. I was introduced to Sadhguru. And Sadhguru is basically a mystic and a yogi from India. And he has to be one of the most powerful spiritual living masters that I have ever come across. It's essentially like what the Dalai Lama has to offer, but on another level
Mm.
altogether. And so I got introduced to Sadhguru just very randomly on Facebook through a friend of mine. And I didn't believe in Indian gurus and mystics and all this stuff because I just thought it was, most of them are just quacks, right? Like out to cheat a gullible population. But a Russian friend of mine who's an entrepreneur, had shared this on his Facebook, and I thought, why is this Russian guy sharing like this video of a guru? It's like a 3-minute video, and I listened to it, and it was so powerful because Sadhguru just has this ability of just taking very complex ideas and just kind of simply just putting it to you in a way that makes sense. And I was literally listening to him and nodding. Like I remember I had like this physical experience of just sitting there nodding everything he was saying, yes, 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 and kind of nodding. And I stayed up all night watching every video that was on YouTube. They didn't have as much content as they have today, but they had quite a bit of content. I stayed up all night just listening to him. And that was a pivotal moment in my life. And then I took one of his programs in Detroit in 2012. October, I flew down to Detroit with my mom, and we took a program called Inner Engineering. And we learned a technique called Shambhavi Mahamudra Kriya, which is a technique. And Sadhguru said, just practice this for 6 months, twice a day, and you'll see your life will change. And that's exactly what happened. I just followed his instructions. I practiced it every single day for 6 months for twice a day. Even when I was traveling, like I remember I did a big backpacking trip, solo backpacking trip in 2013, 2012, 2013, December, January. And I rang in the New Year in Southeast Asia. And I remember like I was doing the practice even there, as I was traveling.
What's like the gist of the practice?
So, it's hard to explain the practice itself. It's a sort of like a kriya. A kriya means an internal practice, which is you're doing certain steps that involve breathing. It's very hard to explain it. It sounds lame if I explain it. Mm-hmm. It's a 21-minute practice. It involves a combination of breathing and moving your breath in a certain way and channeling your energy in a certain way. Mm-hmm. But what I found is that as soon as I would do the practice, my body chemistry would change. If I was in a state of torment or was in a state of agitation, I'd do the practice and I would come into a state of centeredness just like that. And then after 6 months, I found that thanks to doing the practice, I didn't have to try to meditate. I was just becoming meditative. In small, like very small windows of time. Like I could sit down for 5 minutes and not get restless, And then later on, I learned that what had happened is that when one's body chemistry changes and when we actively work with our energies, because, as human beings, we're an aggregation of 4 things, right? Our physical body, our mental body, our emotions, and our energies. And often I think what we try to work with is the mind, but the mind is the hardest to work with, because the mind in yoga is called the monkey mind, which means by nature, it's a restless entity. So then trying to work with the mind is like trying to work with a monkey and to really training it, right? So that's actually the wrong place to start with. But and I didn't know this going into it. I just did the technique because I was asking the question, hey, I want a technique, I want a master, I want a technique. And I got the technique and it worked for me. And then later when I dug into it, what I realized and what Sadhguru talks about is that if you work with your energies, which is what inner engineering teaches you how to, then it's very easy to bring your mind and your body into control, And and I think he even says, if you bring your body into your control, then I think you have control over 30% of your life. If you bring your mind into your control, you have control of 60% of your life. But if you bring your energies into control, you have 100% control in your life. And that started to become a reality for me, where I just started to realize that my abilities and my competence was starting to multiply when I was doing that. And so much of the mental noise that I had experienced throughout most of my 20s just started to fall off. And even within like about 1.5 years or 2 years of doing this, within 6 months, I saw a lot of benefits. First of all, I started feeling peaceful, less agitated, less tormented, which is wonderful for me, which means my energies were getting channeled. And within 2 years, I developed such an intense clarity. And, in my experience, what I saw is like this idea of the third eye opening, which is not physically like the third eye opening, but really just having a very high level of clarity and being very deeply in touch with my true self, all the mental noise just started to fade away. And I think the third year was the most pivotal. Now I've been doing this for about 8 years. Like the third year was very pivotal. Like it happened in a very stark way. Like the changes happened rapidly. And then I found that I was living from the inside out as opposed to the outside in. Because often the way we are as human beings, the way we've been built up, is we take all the inputs from the outside world, and then that dictates who we are. So if the world tells us we are amazing, we're this, we're that, then we create our identity by what the world tells us, right? And if we've been told we're ugly, we're failures, and that becomes our internal dialogue. Whatever it is the world tells us through our conditioning, then we become that. But this idea of living from the inside out is regardless of what is happening in the world outside, it can be an absolute chaos, but you have complete control over your interiority. You're not affected. You can respond to the world and you're not reacting and going crazy. You can respond to the world, and that is the higher faculty of a human being. And that's what these practices taught me. And I just kept it up. And then I just started to realize, wow, like all these abilities within myself that I didn't know I had started to surface. All these gifts, the clarity, the perception. Yeah, I just started discovering abilities in myself I didn't even know I had. Right.
Hmm.
So it was a very transformative time. I would say, if now looking back, I would say that was the most exciting period in my life. It's like finding a gold mine within yourself, you
Hmm.
know?
Yeah. Wow. That sounds amazing. I'm gonna have to definitely check this guy out. What's his name again?
His name is Sadhguru, Sadhguru, Sadhguru. He
Hmm.
has a channel. I think he has like over 5 million followers. And by the way, like he has like all sorts of followers, from like Will Smith to Adrian Grenier, if you remember him from Entourage, and like some huge celebrities who are following him as well. He's now become very, very famous in North America. So I think in the next few years, he'll be a household name just because he
Hmm.
has such big celebrities who are his disciples and followers. But when I found him, he was hardly a celebrity. Like,
Hmm.
I had a lot of access to him because of that. So yeah, I would definitely say check it out, and
Yeah.
also check out Inner Engineering. If you just, I think, YouTube or Google Sadhguru Inner Engineering, just go to YouTube and look up Sadhguru Inner Engineering,
Hmm.
and he explains the process,
Hmm.
just what it means. And in my experience of now having done it for 8.5 years, I just realized every moment, every day, every week, every year, I'm just growing. And
Hmm.
there is no limit, no ceiling to my growth. And this is true of every human being. This is not something that special to me. Every human being is capable of this. It's just that we have to turn inwards and discover our own gold mine, because we're all carrying our own gold mine,
Hmm.
and we have to mine that gold to reach our full potential in our lives. And that might not look like somebody else. It might not be like that guy or this woman, or because they're all on their own journeys. But
Hmm.
what's important is, are we on our own journey, and are we discovering our peak potential?
Hmm.
And I'm really grateful to Sadhguru for bringing that into my life.
Yeah. So essentially, he and your year of traveling abroad set up the foundation for you to discover your current purpose that you're working towards, right?
Yeah, I would say so, very much.
Do you have any advice for people who are thinking about the purpose? How should they go about it?
I would say for people that are thinking about their purpose, your purpose is not something, again, that comes from the outside in. You know, because often I think when people look for their purpose, they look to other people to see what everybody else is doing, and then they say, okay, it seems like the way to do it is to join this kind of company because they're achieving these kind of results, and therefore that becomes my purpose. Like, I think one narrative, I'll give you an example of the narrative in our society that's now so predominant, is that everyone is a startup entrepreneur.
Hmm.
And it's like that's the new narrative that's built in. Like, what's your side hustle? That has to be your purpose. Find your purpose through your side hustle, right? But if you do something like that, you're just going to be a chicken with your head cut off, because your purpose is not coming from within, from your true authentic self. When you take the time and make the effort to discover who your truest authentic self is, then you automatically come into a space where you want to be a problem solver. The thing is, we're conditioned again to compete, to be better than people around us. So when people are finding their purpose, really their motivation is, how do I find a purpose that is also going to make me better than somebody else, more famous than somebody else, richer than somebody else, right? I mean, this is like, that's where so many of our societal narratives come from. Um, But if your purpose actually emerges truly from within, then you will look at the world and say, where are the problems in this world? And how can I be that solution? And you're not doing it because it's sexy and it'll get you fame. You're doing it because you truly want to be mother to the world. And this is what Sadhguru actually talks about. And it's something that's introduced in engineering, which I really held on to, which is this idea of being the mother to the world. Which leads to this idea, which leads to this behavior of wanting to do what's necessary in the world, as opposed to what's glamorous and what's sexy, what's going to make you money, what's going to make you famous, right? So there's a whole different way of thinking about it. So do you think about your purpose as something that's like outside in, where you look at everybody else and you see what's everybody else's purpose and therefore I choose my purpose? Or do you spend a few years working on building yourself, and then from within, truly, your true self will tell you, your authentic self will tell you, hey, this is a problem I want to solve. And then you follow that purpose, regardless of what you think the outcome is, you know?
Hmm. Yeah.
Um,
Thank you. That's very great insights. Thanks for sharing that.
you're welcome.
Yeah. So we're about to reach the last few minutes of the podcast. So I'm just gonna ask you some final lightning round questions, and you can just
Hey,
answer with like a word or a sentence. All right, you ready?
let's go.
So, what's one thing you like to do to relax?
Oh, meditation,
Hmm. What's one thing you like to do for fun?
hiking, scuba diving. I guess skiing, I'm starting to learn how to ski, so maybe that'll become fun. I don't know if it's going to be fun initially when I'm rolling down the hills and when my 4-year-old is learning faster than me, but I'm hoping that that's something that'll become fun.
Yeah, we'll see. What's one habit you are working on?
Oh gosh, such a good question. There's actually a couple, but one habit that I'm actively working on is waking up consistently at 4 a.m. and going to bed by 10 p.m. Because I find that, yeah, I just find that waking up early sets a completely different tone to the rest of the day as opposed to waking up at 7 a.m., for instance,
Mm, wow. What's one habit you would like to have?
Oh, that habit. I want to wake up
Okay.
at 4 a.m.
If you have one superpower, what would you have?
I have so many superpowers. This is what's fascinating about the process of self-discovery, is that we just have so many superpowers within us. So if there's one superpower that I could have, is to discover all my superpowers almost all at once. So I
Mhm.
could just live at my peak potential every moment and not really falter. But I think faltering and learning is a part of the process and the journey.
Yeah.
But yeah, if I had to fantasize, I would say my superpower would be, how do I discover all my superpowers right away and live in my peak potential at this moment, starting right now?
I love that answer. If you're not doing what you are doing today, what would you be doing?
I don't know. I don't even think that way.
Hmm.
I don't know.
Okay.
I'd be a mom. I don't know.
How would you describe your ideal life?
I'm in my ideal life. I'm doing exactly what I'm supposed to be doing. I'm living the way I want to live. I'm growing and discovering every moment. And I'm excited about the journey that I'm going on. This is my ideal life.
That's amazing. And lastly, are there any requests you would like our listeners to do after listening to this?
The request is go check out Sadhguru. If you are looking to grow authentically, which I know a lot of people are, because I meet a lot of people, and I think their question is always like, how do I live purposefully? This is, I would say, figure out a way you can discover your authentic self. Go check out Sadhguru. I mean, this is the tool that I know. You don't have to follow this tool. These are tools that I know and have worked for me. So I'd say just go check out that channel. Listen to him.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you so much, Dee, for your time. It was a great pleasure speaking with you and hearing all your stories. It's been so insightful and very exciting. Oh my gosh, your life is just fascinating. Learning so much from you.
Yeah, it sure is. I'm so grateful you're doing this awesome content and I get to be a part of that journey. So congratulations on launching it, and congratulations on taking the step in this direction.
All right. Yes. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Wing.
So here are the key takeaways from this episode. Your purpose has to come from within, from your true authentic self. That means before you know your purpose, you first need to truly know yourself. We all have a gold mine within us waiting to be discovered, but it does take work. For Dee, she found hers first by embarking on a backpacking trip around the world alone. After such a life-changing, unique experience, she returned home feeling completely out of place and tormented with even more existential questions. It was then that she started exploring spirituality on a deeper level, particularly the teachings of Sadhguru, which gave her the clarity that changed her life. Through Sadhguru, she learned the tools she could use to train her emotion and energy to bring her mind and body into control. Her mental noise started to dissipate, and she developed intense clarity that enabled her to get deeply in touch with her true self. She was even discovering abilities within her that she didn't even know she had. What she learned was that no matter what happens externally, we all have the power to completely control what happens within, and then we can choose to respond to what happens externally consciously, instead of just reacting compulsively. And that brings us back to Dee's purpose now. She sees the external problem of climate change, and she is responding by building a company called Maahi to solve one part of that problem. Her goal is to shift the status quo from big agriculture to a more local urban farming paradigm. Since this interview, I've devoured countless videos of Sadhguru on YouTube. Like Dee said, everything he said just flashed like a light bulb of truth in my core. I even did his online inner engineering course and came away from his teaching feeling more alive, joyful, excited about life and taking charge of it. In some regards, his teachings did inspire me to let go of the fear and to have the confidence to just do this podcast that I've been thinking of. So do yourself a favor and just watch one of his videos on YouTube after this show. I'll include some good ones in the show note. I hope you've enjoyed the second episode of this podcast. I am excited to continue to nurture, improve, and grow a work in purpose and to share more inspiring stories and what I'll learn along the way. But I cannot do it alone. I need your help and support to grow our podcast. Please subscribe, tell your friends about it, rate it 5 stars, or even recommend some awesome guests to me by visiting aworkinpurpose.com. Please also join our community on Facebook where we can spark discussions and support one another in our progress towards our purpose. You have my greatest gratitude for listening. May your present moment now and forever be filled with light and love. Until next time, this is Wing of A Working Purpose.